Hello, my name is Nick Hart, and my new album, Nick Hart Sings 9 English Folk Songs, is out on the 1st of May 2019. Depending on when you're watching this, it might be out already. But I thought it would be a good idea to have someone interview me about the album, and nobody in any of the proper channels was prepared to do so. So I've got my friend John Wilks to do it for me. It's very much the wrong way around of doing things, but it's the best I could do.
So, new album
Yes.
is Nick Hart Sings 9 English Folk Songs.
Yeah.
Previous album was Nick Hart Sings 8 English Folk Songs.
Yes.
I'm sensing a theme.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people have been reading a lot into that. I think in reality, it's just lack of imagination. I think that really is all it is.
But honesty is important, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it was actually going to be called Nick Hart Sings 10 English Folk Songs, but
You only had 9.
yeah, well, we recorded 10, and one of them wasn't very good, so we just put 9 on it and changed the title accordingly.
I'm interested in the fact that you're just a 28-year-old boy,
29.
29-year-old boy, large boy, and you've got this thing about traditional folk music. You're passionate about it. It keeps you awake at night, and I personally I think that's wonderful. But I find it quite fascinating that that you've arrived at that point in your life where that's something that takes up so much of your time.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that I'm not the only person of my age for whom it's a source of fascination. But yeah, I mean, I grew up with it to a certain extent. So my dad played for Morris dancing, so I was always around it growing up. It wasn't a little bit later that I, particularly with I was playing instrumental music first, and then it was whilst I was at university that I kind of really latched onto the song tradition in a big way. But I think there's something. I studied ethnomusicology, and it was, I was studying traditional music from all over the world, and actually realising that I kind of wanted to tend my own garden, in certain respects. All this amazing, fascinating music from all over the place that I was getting to study was brilliant. But the conclusion I kept coming to was, well, they're doing a very good job of playing the kora in Mali, for instance, so they probably don't need my help.
So, was there a point where you were actually going out and trying to perform unaccompanied? And if so, how does a modern audience take to that?
I did do it a few times, and the answer is I don't know that you would necessarily describe the audiences I was performing to as particularly modern audiences. But I did a couple of folk club gigs unaccompanied, and it was really nice. But some people thought it was really nice, and some people thought it was bloody boring.
But that's something that I find really interesting. Sorry, I use that phrase far too much. I think that's a very interesting point. Well, something that certainly caught my attention, certainly since I've started performing traditional music, is audiences now don't expect. Like when I was saying audiences now, I'm not talking about the folk audience, the folk club audience, I should say, who are used to it. I'm talking about people who are first time coming to traditional music. They expect a few things that traditional music really kind of challenges them on. Unaccompanied singing is uncomfortable for a lot of people who haven't seen it before, and it's really again it's brave performance, isn't it? Because it's absolutely no tightrope. Absolutely no safety net.
Yeah.
And similarly, traditional music, when it's performed in the way that you perform it, is I don't want to say it's amateurish, because that's obviously not what it is, but it is pared down so much that the polished edges are knocked off, and that's not something that your modern audience is necessarily used to.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I get you what you mean. I think it's essentially one step further. It's just the next step along from being unaccompanied, really, isn't it? I think for me, the sort of exciting stuff is, being able to, because if you're performing on your own, the capacity to kind of like extemporize and pull and push and do things differently. That's sort of where the excitement is for me as a performer. I'm not really interested in hammering out a polished performance, which is going to be the same every night. I think that a lot of the performers that I find most exciting and to watch, there is always that element of like spontaneity in it. So I think I'd hope that what my performance style lacks in precision and repeatability, it makes up for in a bit of dynamism, because of the spontaneous nature of it. Does that make any sense?
Well, of course it does, and I think it's. It's. I suppose it's why I have come to enjoy the sort of thing that you do. It's why a certain element of that has crept into what I do, because everything's so polished. I mean, that's for me what's attractive about traditional music is it's survived. There's an element of survival of the fittest, so it's already had its edges knocked off, but it's still left in this quite raw state, and it's quite unusual to find something these days. I think that certainly in the music world that hasn't been
that's meant to be shit. yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah,
that's meant to be as is.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean.
You've mentioned. I'm conscious that a lot of people who'll be watching this video will be people who know about and enjoy traditional music. But part of the hope is that other people who are coming to it for the first time can learn a little about what we're talking about and that kind of thing. One name that keeps popping up is Martin Carthy.
Yeah.
I always say that Martin Carthy is probably the most influential musician that most people have never heard of.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, I could go with that.
What does he? What's the importance of Martin Carthy to a man like yourself?
I mean, I think it can't be overstated, really. I think in terms of it's a really interesting thing to look at his career, and in terms of most of us have heard other ways of playing a guitar before we've heard Martin Carthy and everyone who's was influenced by him. And so it's the temptation is to think that, okay, so you play the guitar in the way that it was used in essentially black American music, which has trickled down through rock and roll and all pop music between the late 50s and the however recently. And the temptation is to then think, well, obviously, Martin Carthy was then decided to do something very different, which is obviously it's partially true. But what's fascinating is you think about when he started playing the guitar, which would have been early 60s,
late 50s, early 60s.
Early. You think actually we hadn't really been playing guitars very long in this country. It was a new thing.
Well, he came to it, I think, off the back of the skiffle boom. So he must have only been playing for a couple of years when he sort of moved on into the traditional.
So I think that's what's interesting is for people like I mean, you're closer to my age than you are to Martin's age. So if we can say broadly speaking of our generation, I think it's hard to kind of understand how to kind of get into your head how recent all of that would have been. Do you know what I mean? How all that American kind of rock and roll skiffle, all that sort of stuff would have been such a new thing, and he managed to kind of. He obviously had been exposed to it for a little bit, and then managed to sort of completely ignore it by the sounds of things. And what you get was this sort of very, I don't know, kind of unadulterated, it seems to me, interpretation of the English song tradition, and so I think really he was kind of the first person to do it, in a way that you could sort of apply it to any English traditional song. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the approach that I take. In terms of finding a way of playing the guitar to accompany songs, for me, unless I could, it's like the way people are talking about feminism now. If your feminism doesn't include all women, then it's not feminism. You know what I mean? In terms of the intersectionality in feminist thought, which is now so prevalent. But similarly, and far less importantly, my approach to accompanying folk songs is if your style of accompanying folk songs isn't appropriate for all folk songs, then it's not a very good way of accompanying folk songs. Does that make sense? So the way I play the guitar, I feel like I could do that. I could go through that process and do that to any folk song, and it would basically work. And I think Martin Carthy kind of hit on that thing quite early on. His way of accompanying folk songs didn't rely on the folk songs sounding a bit like this or a bit like that. It allowed them to kind of exist on their own terms, and what he did, his accompaniment sort of just supports it. And I think that's I don't think there's many people who've managed to do that since, let alone before.
Well, it's quite unusual to find an album these days by somebody who's making traditional folk music now that hasn't at some point, songs that haven't at some point been done by Martin Carthy or one of his relatives.
Yeah, yeah. He really has had all the good ones. We're left just picking around whatever dross he thought wasn't.
Or, I mean, this is what fascinates me as well, because you've got this amazing thing in traditional music whereby a song doesn't necessarily stay the same. Of course, as it travels, as it evolves, it changes, it loses verses get added. It's a really organic thing. And we've talked about this a lot privately. We're not a lot of fun to hang around, me and Nick. But we've talked about this a lot privately. But there's this song called Georgie.
Yeah.
Or Geordie.
Or Geordie, yeah.
It has two names, but seemingly hundreds of different versions. And Martin Carthy did a class version, very, very classic version, which I've heard you perform once with Domini.
Yeah.
But as you said earlier, you're quite interested in the idea of seeking out some of those lesser-known versions. And Georgie, I think, is quite a good example of that. It's on your new album, so it's entirely relevant to this conversation. Presumably you heard the Martin Carthy version first.
I'm not sure I did.
Controversial.
Actually, yeah, I'm not sure I might have done, but I'm not sure I was necessarily very aware of it. I actually learned that one ages ago, like when I was about 20 or 21.
But what's the difference, the chief difference between one like that, and I'm picking that one particularly because, traditional folk fans will know that song very well, and people who are coming to the tradition for the first time and exploring it will no doubt come across a version of that fairly soon, and it's likely to be the one that Carthy had a crack at.
Yeah.
But yours isn't. What's the difference?
I guess, what's the difference between the songs, or what's the difference between why am I choosing to do a new one rather than doing one of the ones that...
No, I think what's the difference between the versions of the songs? I mean, is it a difference in location? Is it a difference in... where does it come from?
I mean, I guess the old adage, there are as many versions of a song as there are singers. So all these versions that were collected at various points from different people, some of them very, very similar, some of them wildly different. And what's wonderful about it is that there can be one version of a song collected in one part of the country, and then which is almost identical to one collected at the other point, whereas somewhere 5 miles down the road from Point A might have a completely different version. There seems to be, no matter how much rhyme or reason we try to apply to it, it's constantly baffling, really. But I mean, I guess what was your question about why does one choose one over another? Or
I suppose there could be any number of versions of this question. I'm not putting it...
There are as many versions of this question
as there are me to ask it.
Yeah.
So there is not one.
So one.
And I think what I'm getting at is, yes, I suppose ultimately it's like, if you've got these so many different versions, and you as somebody who's attracted to a song partly because of the rarity of a version, what was it about that song that particularly grabbed you?
Well, I think
that version.
Okay,
sorry.
yeah, okay. Now I get what you're saying. I'm
not sure that's what I was saying at the beginning.
Okay, well,
that's what I'm saying.
I get what you're saying now in this moment. I mean, that version comes. I actually got from a book written by Mary Humphreys, which is called Folk Songs Collected in Cambridgeshire, which is where I'm from. I think a lot of the songs I find, I do tend to look for versions that have come from close to where I come from. So, or that's at least a starting point, and I'll then work outwards until I find one I like. I mean, you can't just work your way through every single version of Georgie, because it would take you ages and ages and ages. So I just sort of will leaf through,
I suspect
things
that,
until I find one I
that
like.
could be the third Nick Hart album.
Well, Nick Hart sings 10 different versions of Georgie. Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. We'll get a crowdfunder up for that one. See how it goes.
I'll put a fiver in.
But Martin Carthy's done a couple of different versions, maybe
He has,
even
yeah.
3 different versions. In fact, both of which. So I also sometimes perform in a duo with a wonderful singer called Dominique Hooper, and she, I'm very keen to find the most obscure version I can, because I like people to think that I'm clever and that I've worked hard, searching through the archives. But Dominique doesn't care about that. She just likes the ones that sound nice, which is probably a better set of criteria. But so we've done both. We've done 2 versions of Georgie. We might have even done 3, which are all distinct from the version that I do. So yeah, there's loads of them. It's a good song though.
It is a great song. It is a great song.
It's quite hard to sing though, because it's got lots of E sounds in them, and E is quite difficult. You know what I mean? If you're an opera singer or a pop singer and you're singing either in an operatic voice or a sort of mid-Atlantic accent, you can get away with making some quite nice full E sounds. But if you're singing, broadly speaking, in one's own accent, and one's own accent is from the south of England, then that E sound is quite. It's quite there's not much tone to it, so it's quite it's a nice story, but
I suspect that's one of the things that bothers you more than anybody else.
Yeah, well, I hope it does.
One of
Otherwise, a
many
lot of people are going to be very bothered by it.
You talked about coming from Cambridgeshire, and we had a couple of songs there on the album, John Riley and remind me. There's another one from the east of the country.
Georgie's from Cambridgeshire. I'm trying to remember what is on the album now. I mean, a lot of them.
The one that you learnt from Peter Bellamy's singing.
The Molecatcher, yeah, that's a Norfolk version. Actually, probably most of the songs are from East Anglia.
Does it mean something you to be singing songs from them or not? Songs from that area.
I mean, I think it's not like I think when I first got interested in traditional song, I was like, right, I'll start in sort of places near to where I grew up, and I'll work my way outwards. And it turns out actually you can spend a long time just looking at songs from that one little corner of England. So most of them are still from there. I think if I'm looking for, a lot of the songs I've learned from recordings of source singers, a lot of songs I've got from, looking up the Full English Archive on the EFTAS website, which is a wonderful resource. And they've got a great function there where you can find things you can look on a map, it's linked up with Google Maps, and it will show you where songs are collected. And I think I do just tend to, I guess maybe because I know what the maps of that part of the country look like. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of songs from elsewhere on that album and in my repertoire. But I don't, I'm not from, my family aren't from the eastern counties for generations and generations. Most of my grandparents were Londoners, really, who kind of moved out there at various stages after the Second World War. So it's not like I am, I have some definitely deep roots in that part of the country. But I definitely like singing songs that are from nearby, and I can do the accent from around there. It's a bit.
So you put it on?
It's the whole thing's affected.
Yeah.
I think that is an interesting thing. I do listen back, I'm like, oh, that's I think a lot of the time is I have learnt these songs from source singers who do have very pronounced East Anglian accents. And I think when I was a kid, there's some videos and audio tapes of me from when I was a child, and I did have a bit like an old Cambridge accent, a bit more like that. And, it does come out in the pub every now and again. But also, I think a lot of the issue is both of the albums I've recorded, Nick Hart sings 8 English folk songs and Nick Hart sings 9 English folk songs. Both of them are recorded in Tom Moore's parents' house. Tom Moore's dad has very, very thick old Suffolk accent.
Oh, okay.
And so obviously, and and I think it obviously just rubs off on me for the few days before we start recording that album. So it is a bit more pronounced than.
But take some
would
sort
be
like
otherwise.
for example, off Nick Hart sings 8 English folk songs.
Yeah.
You have Butter and Cheese, which is one of my all-time favourite songs.
Thank you very much.
Well, you didn't write it, but
No, that's true.
take that back.
Yeah, you're right.
The first time I heard it was you, so you can have that.
Oh, thank God! You keep taking it away, giving it back. I don't know where I'm coming or going here.
But it led me to Sam Larner's version.
Yeah,
And Sam Larner was an old fisherman,
yeah, it was.
and I think when for example, this is getting really geeky, and I apologise, but you sing the word chimley instead of chimney in that song,
There is the word chimney. Yeah,
and Sam Larner does as well, obviously,
Yeah.
because that's his natural accent. But I feel like if you put the word chimney back in there, you've lost something.
chimney. It's
Rather than chimley.
It's the N sound is too much of an interruption in the word. The L really helps it, just flow along a lot more nicely. Actually, I did used to say chimley, and I remember getting teased about it at school. Someone was like, "It's not chimney, it's chimney with an N." And I was like, I thought I'd been saying it wrong, but I hadn't. It was just that's. It's actually I've been doing a lot of research on this. It turns out lots of people all over the country call it chimley.
Chimley.
Chimley. It's like there's the eggs thing. Have I told you the eggs thing?
No.
My friend James McDonald told me this. So when they were when Johnson was compiling the first dictionary,
Yeah.
he was obviously after having to, systematise the English language for the first time, and so obviously all these various dialect ways of saying words, he had to kind of pick and choose from a lot of the time. So the thing that comes out of the end of a chicken is called
Egg.
an egg, yeah, which is the singular that we use today is egg, and lots of people call it an egg, but lots of people in lots of other parts of the country called it an eggy. So he had a toss up as to whether it would be an egg or an eggy, and then he just went with egg, and then he had to choose between the two common pluralizations, one of which was eggs, but the other one which was eggrun, as in brethren or children or
Yeah.
And but if he'd have chosen differently, we could all be saying, "No, do you want scrambled eggs? Oh, eggrun. Yes, please. How would you want? Do you want one eggy or
Several
two
eggrun.
eggrun?
I'll have several eggrun, please.
Yeah.
I want to know about things like A Ship to Old England, which is another song on the album, and it's about the Napoleonic Wars, from what I can see.
Yeah, I think it probably is.
What connection do you have with the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, the short answer would be none. I think that's what's in. But then, what connection did Walter Pardon, who I got the song from, have with it? I would argue probably not very much either.
Yeah.
So, that there is something to be said. I think there is.
It's okay. You don't have to be completely authentic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I'm good. I'm glad. But I think there is. I think it's a common accusation levelled against folk music and folk musicians, and I think the point is that it performs a different function. When you sing a folk song, you are not necessarily embodying that character in the way that you are in pop music. You know what I mean? So the idea of it being a sort of that sense of distance, the fact that it is primarily storytelling, I think allows you to get away with a lot. But interestingly, that story, that song is a bit. I don't necessarily agree with all the sentiments in it. That refers to the French as dogs, which is very unkind, I think. But actually is a really interesting thing to look at, because you think it's kind of mad to think that we were at war with one of our closest neighbours, which actually at a time when Brexit may or may not be going ahead, you think that's quite terrifying. It's quite nice, isn't it, that we haven't been at war with any other European nations for a while.
Or press gangs.
I haven't had that for a while. What else hasn't happened off that album?
That's about it.
That's about everything that's totally relevant.
Two Sisters, for example.
Yeah, I mean,
What's that about?
what is it about? That's a really mad one. That's a really old, that's like an old one. So actually, that version I sing, I got from the Child Ballads, which, for those of you who don't know, is a huge collection of five volumes of just lyrics. Really, there's not really melodies for the most of the songs in it. So that. I got it from there, and that version is largely from a 17th century source. That was without that one didn't have a melody in it, so I kind of wrote the melody for that one. Although I realised later it's quite similar to a version of An Old Man Came Courting Me sung by one of the Brazel family. Anyway, but yeah, I mean that's a really weird old dark one, and it's the sort of thing where you think that was probably quite old when it was first printed. Do you know what I mean? Like weird and dark and kind of got a bit of magic in it, which is, a fairly rare thing in folk songs actually.
Well, it seems the older you get with them, the more common it is.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
I'm thinking about shape shifting.
Yeah.
Not at this instant, but
you're not considering
thinking
it as
about
an
moving
option.
house. Thinking about shape shifting.
Shifting.
I'm thinking about that song that's now escaped me, but the famous shape shifting
Yeah, the
song.
Two Magicians.
Two Magicians or Fairport Convention. Martin Simpson.
I don't know.
Neither of us actually know anything about folk music.
Yeah. I know the Two Magicians Martin Carthy version of that.
Totally escaped my brain now.
Is there is Tamlin?
That's what I'm looking for. Renadine.
Grenadine. That was about a sort of fox man.
Yeah,
shape
shape-shifting. There you go.
Yeah.
So but you wrote the tune to Two Sisters. Is that
I
allowed?
think so. Yeah. Well, what else am I going to do? Just say it.
Does it stop it being traditional? I'm really playing devil's advocate here.
Does it stop it being traditional? Does it matter?
Good answer.
But I don't think it does stop it being traditional. I mean, it's the melody. If I listen back to a version, like the original version of say I've learnt a version of a song from a source singer, and I then go back and listen to that recording 6 months later, like the melody I sing will be quite different anyway, which is quite a nice, reassuring thing to realise that sort of folk process is going on amongst us as well. Do you know what I mean? That way, that changing the lyrical content or the melodies of songs, it just does happen.
Well, it's just occurred to me that's the perfect argument against those people who think that when you go to see Bob Dylan, he should be singing the same version of a song that he recorded in 1962.
Yeah.
And he always does it slightly differently.
Yeah. Do you think he does it just to piss them off?
I think he does it to piss them off, but I also have read him say, so this isn't really the first time this has occurred to me, but I have read him say in interviews, he's responded to that question by saying, well, what makes you think that the version that I recorded in 1963 was the definitive version? Usually I'd only just written the song a day before, so you think it shouldn't have changed over the last 55 years?
Yeah, I think there is something in that, but it's also like how often does Bob Dylan listen to his own bloody records? I can't imagine very often. I mean, I would hope not.
That's all he does every morning, before breakfast, blood on the tracks.
Blood on the tracks. But I mean, I think there is something in. Again, even listening back to I listened back to the first album of mine, which came out in the beginning of 2017. I listened back to that recently, having not listened to it for probably over a year, and I realised that I do things very differently now. I've done that because you do, don't you? Things sort of change and evolve, and unless you are reminding yourself what it sounds like, by listening to your own record every morning, in which case I think you've got. You need to sit down and ask yourself some serious questions. But it's always going to change, and I think it's right that it does.
So the last thing I want to talk about is just the performance of songs, because I think one of the great things about traditional folk songs is that you've got tragedy, you've got sort of treachery, you've got romance, you've got sort of honesty, you've got betrayal, you've got all these things going on in these songs, and quite a lot of folk performers make a very similar joke when they get on stage. It's like, welcome to a fun evening of folk music, everybody's going to die, sort of thing.
Yeah, I've heard that joke a few times,
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But the question, I suppose, is about humour. That's something that sort of I think is really important part of going to a folk gig. When I played recently in London to a largely non-traditional folk audience, a fairly young audience, and the first couple of songs, the atmosphere wasn't quite what I was hoping for, and it seemed to me, and afterwards I was talking to them, it seemed to me afterwards they didn't know what to do. It was a funny thing. They were almost treating this traditional folk music as a classical thing. We should take this seriously. This is a folk concert, and they didn't realise that it's as you said before. There's a spontaneity to it. There's it's okay to laugh.
Yeah,
and it's okay. And part of that sort of give and take between the audience is what makes it quite special. But one of the first times I saw that done really well, without wanting to flatter you too much, was at a concert that you played.
oh, you're so kind.
Stop it!
Oh, you all
Stop it!
pot.
You no, I think there's a big part of performing, isn't there? It's not a lot of people will say sort of Steve Roud, who's a sort of great folk historian, will say there's no such thing as a folk singer because back in the day when folk singers existed, they weren't folk singers; they were just blokes in the pub singing songs. And it wasn't a career option for them.
Certainly not.
So I'm not sure that it's a career option for a lot of people now.
I'm starting to work work out that it may not be a career option as well.
But there is a performance element to it, isn't there?
Yeah, certainly, and I think there is. I think I'm very lucky that actually one of my. So Simon Ritchie is a wonderful man who lives in the next village to where my dad lives.
Shapeshifter.
He's almost always a man. Well, every time I've seen him, he's been in his human form. I mean, he's a lot of the time he is sort of by volume probably about 20 or 30% Green King IPA, but so in Thaxted, which is the next village to where my dad lives in northwest Essex. There is a very brilliant living kind of tradition there of folk music centred around the Morris men, but it's something in which the community are quite involved, and it's not like they don't just like tuck themselves away at the back of a village hall somewhere like a lot of it's very much a part of the town. It's actually, because it is actually a town, so I think sort of. There's that Simon is a very prominent member of that community, but there is lots of great singers in Thaxted, and actually that sense of having at a fairly young age been in the pub there, listening to all that and seeing how it works in the pub, like in its natural context, I think has been a really useful thing, and has certainly informed a lot of the way I like to do things. But I think it's that. I think when you're presenting something which is someone else's written, it's a bit different to. Like, I did try to write songs when I was younger. It's quite hard. I didn't really like. You know what I mean? It's like it's a bit much, and you're kind of putting yourself on the line. There's a sense of detachment, I think, that comes with playing folk songs, which is kind of nice. And I think it's easy. I think it's easier to kind of be humorous about it without it having to be like a comedy act, you know what I mean? And in terms of like the content, there's a lot of there is a lot of humorous songs, which if you think about now, like if a piece of popular music is funny, it's considered a piece of novelty music, whereas actually that's not the case in
you're not being a novelty performer, are you? I mean, again, I think you may have said this originally to me when we did an interview together a couple of years back. About the song "Butter and Cheese" off your first album, that it's likely to have had enough time in existence to have the crap verses knocked out of it, and the humour in it sort of honed just by the generations of people who've performed it.
Yeah,
and I think that slightly takes it away from being a novelty song, in that sort of novelty or a novelty comedy song that somebody has sat down and specifically written for a current audience or something like that. This is something that has survived in its humorous state.
I mean, that song is a funny example though, because it's like mostly. I mean, it's a bit funny, but mostly it's just odd. It's really weird. Like, do you know what I mean? I mean that
it's a great story.
I see that more as a function of the sort of process of oral transmission, in that it's like, I mean, maybe it once did make more sense than it does now.
I think it makes perfect sense.
I
Same
mean,
with
it's
the
got a
mole
beginning,
catcher.
middle, and an end, I suppose. Yeah, the mole catcher is a bit more of a structure, which is off the new album. That's a bit more structured in its comedy. It's got a couple of good gags at the end.
It does. And this interview won't have, because I think we're bringing it to its conclusion here.
Great, and we'll do that with the utmost seriousness.
Yes. Nick Hart, thank you very much for speaking to me.
John Wilks, thank you very much for speaking to me.
Do go and see Nick when he's out on the road very soon. I believe you're touring, aren't you?
Yeah, throughout May and June, or not? I mean, not throughout. On some days during May and June. I wish I was touring throughout May and June.
Can you
Many
remember? I
more
know you're
gigs.
playing in Dorking.
Dorking on the 11th of May, 12th of May in London at the Jamboree. I'm playing in Manchester on the 14th, Liverpool on the 15th of May, I think. Various other ones, Evesham on the 31st or something.
You see, he pretends to be a shambolic, unprofessional man, but he actually knows things, and he.
I'm playing in Bristol on the 5th of June.
It's
In
all.
Cambridge
It is all an act,
Cambridge on the
isn't it?
9th. I never knew I knew so much about my own gigs.
Excellent.
Thank
Good to chat to you.
And you, mate. Cheers. Wow, that was a long one.
52 minutes.
Was it?
52.
Well, let's see if we can get that down to 4.